Hello, class. Coming to you today from the beautiful Jackson Park or Wooded Island, designed by Frederick Law Olmsted in central Chicago. So if you are ever in the bustling city and looking for a quiet place, I recommend coming here. It's beautiful, except for an occasional lawnmower. It's pretty much surrounded by sounds of nature, so that's just lovely. But I wanted to start our class today by reading you an excerpt from The Devil in the White City by Eric Lawson. It's actually a historical fiction murder story, true crime story, but its setting is the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, or as you'll learn, the World's Columbian Exposition. So I wanted to just read you this little bit from the intro because I think it does a great job setting the scene and describing the World's Fair. The other thing that would be great to set the scene is if you watch the World's Fair video that has been posted on Edpuzzle. Then it has some images to go along with these fantastic words. So let's begin class today with just a little reading, and you can do a little listening. Its official name was the World's Columbian Exposition. Its official purpose, to commemorate the 400th anniversary of Columbus's discovery of America. But under Burnham, its chief builder, it had become something enchanting, known throughout the world as the White City. It had lasted just 6 months, yet during that time, its gatekeepers recorded 27.5 million visits. This when the country's total population was 65 million. On its best day, the fair drew more than 700,000 visitors. That the fair had occurred at all, however, was something of a miracle. To build it, Burnham had confronted a legion of obstacles, any of one of which should have killed it long before opening day. Together, he and his architects had conjured a dream city whose grandeur and beauty exceeded anything each singly could have imagined. Visitors wore their best clothes and most somber expressions as if entering a great cathedral. Some wept at its beauty. They tasted a new snack called Cracker Jack and a new breakfast food called shredded wheat. Whole villages had been imported from Egypt, Algeria, Dahomey, and other far-flung locales along with their inhabitants. The Street in Cairo exhibit alone employed nearly 200 Egyptians and contained 25 distinct buildings, including a 1,500-seat theater that introduced America to a new and scandalous form of entertainment. Everything about the fair was exotic, and above all, immense. The fair occupied over 1 square mile and filled more than 200 buildings. A single exhibit hall had enough interior volume to have housed the U.S. Capitol, the Great Pyramid, Winchester Cathedral, Madison Square Garden, and St. Paul Cathedral, all at the same time. One structure, rejected at first as a monstrosity, became the fair's emblem. A machine so huge and terrifying that it instantly eclipsed the tower of Alexander Eiffel that had so wounded America's pride. Never before had so many of the history's brightest lights, including Buffalo Bill, Theodore Dreiser, Susan B. Anthony, Jane Addams, Clarence Darrow, George Westinghouse, Thomas Edison, Henry Adams, Archduke Francis Ferdinand, Nikola Tesla, Ignaz Paderewski, Philip Armour, and Marshall Field gathered in one place at one time. Richard Harding Davis called the exposition the greatest event in history of the country since the Civil War. That something magical had occurred in that summer of the World's Fair was beyond a doubt. But darkness, too, had touched the fair. Scores of workers had been hurt or killed in fire in building the dream, their families consigned to poverty. Fire had killed 15 more, and an assassin had transformed the closing ceremony from what was to have been the century's greatest celebration into a vast funeral. Worse had occurred too, although these revelations emerged only slowly. A murderer had been moving among the beautiful things Burnham had created. Young women drawn to Chicago by the fair and the prospect of living on their own had disappeared Last seen at the killer's block-long mansion, a parody of everything architects held dear. Only after the exposition had Burnham and his colleagues learned of the anguished letters describing daughters who had come to the city and then fallen silent. The press speculated that scores of fairgoers must have disappeared within the building. Even the street-hardened members of the city's Whitechapel Club, named for London's stalking ground of Jack the Ripper, were startled by what detectives eventually found inside and by the fact that such grisly events could have gone undiscovered for so long. The rational explanation laid blame on the forces of change that during this time had convulsed Chicago amid so much turmoil. It was understandable that the work of a young and handsome doctor would go unnoticed. As time passed, however, even sober men and women began to think of him in less than rational terms. He described himself as the devil and contended that his physical shape had begun to alter. Enough strange things began happening to the men who brought him to justice to make his claim seem almost plausible. For the supernaturally inclined, the death of the jury foreman alone offered sufficient proof. So that's the introduction to The Devil in the White City, the tale of America's first serial killer, whose darkness touched what was supposed to be the immense beauty of the White City. Looking at our PowerPoint now, the World's Fair is part of a bigger movement that's actually called the Cities Are Beautiful movement. This idea that the move to urban centers is a good thing, that cities are beautiful places where you have lots of different ideas coming together to create wonderful opportunities in a new way. And so that's also part of this World's Fair. Kind of the White City is supposed to show that cities are beautiful and all the wondrous things that modern conveniences like electricity and the telephone are able to give to the ordinary citizen. But it also represents this shift, and this is where your analyze assignment this week comes in. In 1893, he actually, at the World's Columbian Exposition, he reads his essay on the frontier. His frontier thesis is based on the 1890 census, and he proclaims that the frontier is dead. And so while in terms of contributing to an urban population, maybe that's a good thing, but that's not Turner's point. What he says is American democracy was born of no theorist's dream. It was not carried in the Susan Constant to Virginia, nor in the Mayflower to Plymouth. It came out of the American forest, and it gained new strength each time it touched a new frontier. So Frederick Jackson Turner is actually ringing a warning bell saying that if the frontier is dead, and the frontier is really the essence of America, where are we going to go from here? What does the 20th century look like if there is no more frontier? And that is feeding into what will become this progressive movement, which is really about the concern of the cities. And that brings me to our main subject for today, which I call All That Muck. And this is the bridge that I was talking about when I spoke with you all this morning, that the second industrial revolution leaves a large portion of the population crammed in city, living in the filth of urban centers, and it's creating new problems that people are not used to. And what happens in those cities? These cities that are really not beautiful. Right? And one of the big questions that the progressive era is going to strive to answer is, what is the government's new role? In the Gilded Age, the government was very clearly on the side of big business. They were strike breakers. Whenever the people, the workers, went on strike, the government came in and broke them up. The president sent Pinkerton agents to break up a steel strike. He sends the army to force Pullman back to work. All right, so every time the government has gotten involved in the Gilded Age, it has been on the sides of big interest. So who are the champions of a meritocracy, of democracy? Well, there's going to be a shift kind of at the end of the 19th century to say, oh no, government should protect the common citizen. This will come in the form of the Civil Service Act, where we'll have a civil service exam established so that you have to, meet some minimum education requirements and functionality to be rewarded with a government position. There will be other things passed, like what it's showing you on the slide, to actually limit trust. The Interstate Commerce Act, which I believe was in your reading previously, stated that railroads had to publish their prices so that, Vanderbilt couldn't give some guy who used his railroad all the time one price and, Farmer Joe from Illinois a much higher price because he was only shipping a small amount. Everyone had to publish prices. They had to be publicly accessed so that you couldn't be cheated, kind of thing. The Sherman Antitrust Act is the first antitrust legislation. It is passed in 1890. It's supposed to outlaw combinations that would restrain trade. So it's supposed to break up monopolies. But the problem is it really doesn't distinguish between good and bad. It just says like bigness is badness. And so anything that's big can be broken apart by the Sherman Antitrust Act. And the reality is that in the 1890s, it's really only used to break up unions. They say unions are the ones limiting trade, restraining trade, and so it's used to actually attack the unions, not really to break up many of the big trusts. That won't come until the first decade of the 20th century when Teddy Roosevelt and other progressive trust busters come in and pass kind of an updated Sherman Antitrust Act. All right. So if the answer isn't the government, if the government is not protecting, then where does the burden fall, right? If not the government, then whom? Is it me? Is it you? Is it some other entity? And the answer is, it is you. It is the average citizen that needs to step up, all right? And as the average citizen takes it upon him or herself to offer aid, some of that works out really well, some of it not so much. We're going to look at the Emma Lazarus poem that is engraved on the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty. But one of the passages from that poem, right, the Statue of Liberty is supposed to say, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." Right? America has always been kind of this welcoming place that is going to take people that aren't welcome anywhere, that are being persecuted elsewhere. They are welcome to this free country. But if we're taking all these people, what are they supposed to do once they get here? There's no employment system. There's no education system. The government isn't helping them out. So who is? And this gives rise to a couple of different things. I want to touch briefly on the social gospel now. I'm going to talk about a little bit later. But the social gospel is this idea that those that have much, it is their duty to help those that have little. So certain people like Andrew Carnegie is very big on the social gospel movement. He has been blessed with tremendous acumen in business and tremendous wealth, and it is now his opportunity to help those that are less fortunate. But there's also this other group that I'm going to talk about now, known as the muckrakers. And the muckrakers are mainly journalists, investigative journalists, that are going to rake up the dirt, the muck, in order to expose problems that can lead to progressivism. There are two muckrakers that I would like you to remember. The first is Jacob Riis. This is a photograph by Jacob Riis. A lot of his muckraking is accompanied with beautiful photographs in terms of beauty, meaning that they're very poignantly taken to demonstrate something. This photograph is actually showing an alley in Chicago. You can see kind of the clothes hanging on the lines between the buildings, and all of these people in the streets, and even some of them hanging out the window, are essentially homeless boys. They're kind of the un uneducated but also unsupervised element of the city. If you've seen the Disney musical Newsies, like these are those kinds of people, Oliver Twist type of kids roaming the streets without any real out. And so Jacob Riis exposes some of those sorts of things. The other big muckraker that I'd like you to remember is one of our reading activities this week, and that is Upton Sinclair. Upton Sinclair is most famous for his novel The Jungle. And The Jungle was supposed to talk really about the plight of immigrants, especially in the Chicago area again, but actually it gets people really upset about the meat packing industry and causes reforms to the way our food is processed today. In fact, we'll talk a little bit about this next week, but you may have heard of the FDA. It's in the news frequently now, but the Food and Drug Administration actually is born kind of as a reaction to people's disgust at what Upton Sinclair reveals is common practice in the meatpacking industry. So I hope you take the time to read the 3 little sections that I excerpted from The Jungle this week. So back to the ordinary citizens actually helping in the city, not just exposing the corruption, but helping. And we return to the social gospel. All right, the social gospel, once again, is this idea that it is a Christian duty, right? The gospel is the Christian duty to spread the good news of Jesus Christ. So the social gospel is considered, it has religious ties, it's considered a Christian duty to be charitable, to give to those who do not have as much, to help those in need. Right? And as I said, some of the wealthier citizens do this in different ways. Carnegie establishes schools. Many actually give to schools. But one of the other people that really acts, once again in Chicago, Chicago is going to be the center of a lot of these reform movements, is Jane Addams. Jane Addams establishes what is known as Hull House. And Hull House is a boarding house in Chicago that is specifically for young women. I read in that introduction, right, that women, single women, are flocking to the cities by themselves. And so, like, who's supposed to care for them? Who's supposed to make sure they're doing okay and getting good jobs and not falling into, the oldest occupations of ill repute, if you know what I'm saying? And Jane Addams says, no, we need to establish some sort of framework to help these women. And so she establishes the Hull House, which women can come and stay at and safely board until they have a place to go. Hull House is largely secular, right? Jane Addams runs it. By 1890, there are 150 different religions being practiced in America, and so a lot of other organizations are faith-based organizations that are meant to help those in need. And some of them are still around today. You probably have heard of the YMCA, if not from the ubiquitous dance song that is at seemingly every large dance party you'll ever go to, but maybe you've heard of the YWCA. The YMCA actually stands for something. It stands for Young Men's Christian Association. The YWCA, Young Women's Christian Association. It's not established as a gym, per se, like it is today. It's not a place you go swimming and to work out, but rather it's an organization that is meant to help young men and women that need a safe place to shower, to rest, to just have a moment to themselves. And so these are established all over the country. Right? Another faith-based organization is Salvation Army. Salvation Army is a Roman Catholic organization that is akin to Goodwill, a place where you can give your gently used clothing or furniture, and they will sell it at a greatly reduced cost to people who need those things, or in certain cases, they will give them away. So these organizations, a lot of these helping organizations are actually established right around the turn of the century in the 1890s. Right? The NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, will be established in the first decade of the 20th century. Once again, that is an organization established by African Americans to help African Americans in the 20th century, because they're still trying to get out from under the thumb of slavery and sharecropping and Jim Crow laws and the lack of civil rights that will still be pretty far in the future before it is realized by minorities in most places in this country. Other helping hands that are established kind of in the same time period, the American Red Cross is formed in 1881 by Clara Barton. The temperance movement begins. Temperance is an anti-alcohol movement. It's widely believed that alcoholism is one of the greatest causes of kind of criminal activity and ne'er-do-wells, especially in poorer immigrant communities. And so there's a big movement to ban alcohol in the late 19th century. It will gain more traction in the 20th century, actually resulting in prohibition, the passage of the 18th Amendment in the late teens, and then prohibition through the 1920s, where it's actually illegal to sell and consume alcohol in most places in the United States. But that temperance movement has its origins in this turn of the century kind of era as well. National Women's Suffrage Association is also founded in 1890 by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. Similar to temperance, it will still be 30 years until women get the right to vote, until the suffrage movement is successful. But the suffragettes have been meeting really since 1848 in the Seneca Falls Convention, and in 1890 this National American Women's Suffrage Association is officially formed to consistently fight for the right for women to vote. In the 1890s, actually women do get the right to vote in certain individual states. The first female representatives from, I believe, the state of Montana or Wyoming. Jeanette Rankin is elected kind of as a result of this movement. I have to double check some of those things, but kind of the states accept women, especially some of the newer states, as part of their voting populace long before it is nationally recognized. And women won't get the right to vote until the 19th Amendment in 1920. So we're still a ways from there. Part of all of these movements, all of these organizations, is a result from the fact that the U.S. population has doubled in 30 years. And most of that population is now centered in cities. Now, it's important to note that only 40% of the population is in cities. There are still more people that do not live in cities than live in cities, but the population of cities has tripled. And because of that, there are new problems of urban centers that haven't really been considered before. Refuse, trash is a huge problem, right? When you live on a farm, you compost, you use your waste in different ways. In a city, there's suddenly packaging, and there's different things that you have to throw out. You can't just dig a hole to bury your feces. You have to dump it somewhere. And I mean, in the end of the 19th century, people are complaining of the smell of streets as people are just dumping their waste pails into the gutters outside their houses. So plumbing needs to be improved, sewage needs to be improved. The spaces themselves need to be improved. They need to figure out how to handle the population and the trash created by the population and the transportation, and all of these different things are part of this end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century move. All right, so we first hear about slums and ghettos, both of which are often associated with certain ethnic populations. So there will be ethnic neighborhoods that are established as immigrants move and relocate to certain areas of the city, and those areas fall either intentionally or unintentionally into disrepair as the government doesn't keep up with them. Um, Sorry, I got distracted by a cricket crawling in my wall. There's People are being crammed into apartment buildings, and so cities pass a law, like New York, saying that every apartment building must have a door to a corridor and also a window to the outside. But because a lot of these apartment owners are entrepreneurs in their own right, instead of actually um, opening up their space, they keep the subdivided small apartments that they're cramming these people into, and instead they create what are called dumbbell tenements, which think of like an elevator shaft in a building that is open to the sky. So technically, if you put a window into that elevator shaft, you then have a window to the outside, even though it's just an empty shaft that doesn't get any circulation. But that's what a dumbbell tenement is. It's a reference to the phrase "the dumbbell waiter," which is a little elevator. The idea that your window would be an elevator shaft, so you wouldn't really get any fresh air. And once again, the trash becomes a huge ongoing issue in cities. Right? We move away from romanticism in art and literature. We move towards realism. Um, Huck Finn has certain elements of this. Twain is quick to satirize some of the problems of the day, but Theodore Dreiser writes Sister Carrie about a woman, or no, I guess Maggie, a Girl of the Streets, is about a woman who moves to a city and is forced to do different things. Stephen Crane also writes The Red Badge of Courage, which is about, I think I mentioned this in class before, someone who is anything but courageous. He actually is a coward and runs away and ends up slipping and falling and hurting his head, and everyone thinks he was injured in this great Civil War battle and becomes kind of this hero when in fact he's a coward and shouldn't be regarded as a hero at all. Jack London and the naturalist movement is part of realism. Call of the Wild, the harshness of nature and the cruelty of both man and animals are explored. Here are some paintings of the era. Whistler's Mother is a very famous one. This is Thomas Aiken's, I forget what it's called, Rowers on the Charles River, I think. Marie Cassatt does some mother and child images. And part of the success of muckraking, part of the success of arts and literature is being driven by the growth and popularity of newspapers. Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst own the two largest newspaper companies in the world, the New York World and the New York Journal. Well, maybe not in the world, but definitely in the United States. The New York World and the New York Journal. And they are constantly looking to entertain. In many ways, they are part of this movement we're going to talk about a lot next week with imperialism, but called yellow journalism. In addition to kind of the investigative muckraking sort of stuff, they also have sensational tales that is more akin to the tabloid newspapers today, right? Newspapers would report on the wild, the fantastic, the exaggerated. Sex, scandal, human interest stories are all the rage as it's all a contest to see who can sell more and more and more. And it's called yellow journalism because one of the first colored comics is called The Yellow Kid. And it's this guy up in the corner here. He is featured as the comic spokesperson for many of the things in the day. So here I have a little just activity for us as we do this online together. What do you think is a better example of yellow journalism? Right. This is a little preview of what we're going to talk about next week. Is it 266 killed in USS Maine accident? USS Maine sinks in Havana Harbor. USS Maine destroyed by Spanish treachery. Investigators search for cause of USS Maine explosion. So all of these are potential headlines that you could read in 1898. But only one of them really embodies what yellow journalism is all about. And that is trying to sell, trying to make claims that are a little bit exaggerated in an effort to rile up the populace. All right, so if we can look at these options again, A and B are good, but they're really just facts. 266 sailors were killed when this explosion happened. The headline calls it an accident. All right, so that's tragic. You may or may not want to read about it. USS Maine sinks in Havana Harbor. Okay, a boat sinks. Why do I care? Oh, 266 people die. Ooh, a little bit more interesting. How is that possible? All right, investigators search for the cause. No one wants to read a book report about the investigation. But letter C, the USS Maine destroyed by Spanish treachery. I'm suddenly grabbing that newspaper and I'm thinking, what did Spain do? How dare they destroy a United States vessel? Did they kill Americans? Oh my gosh, they killed 266 Americans. That's an act of war. And suddenly I'm very agitated, and I'm reading that newspaper, and I'm writing to the newspaper. I'm writing to my congressman. I'm telling my friends all about this Spanish treachery, and I'm very, very involved in the news. All right, and so that's part of journalism. Journalism is meant to entertain. But there's also entertainment that starts in the 1890s that also continues through the early 1900s, the 20th century. The dime novels, these little easy to read and very inexpensive books about the Wild West and other romantic, adventurous settings. A lot of the folk tales like Davy Crockett and Buffalo Bill and different, Annie Oakley. Those things are publicized as dime novels that anyone can read. We have Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson, Mark Twain, all becoming more widely read, more popular. The Wild West show is actually a traveling circus, starring Buffalo Bill Cody, Geronimo, who we heard about last week, Annie Oakley, and so it's kind of this show that goes to these cities and towns that's supposed to harken back to those days of yesteryear where you could see people do all these tricks with a rope and a gun and, see this Indian chief that was this thorn in the side of the U.S. cavalry. But it's all just a show. Those of you who have seen The Greatest Showman, you might know the story of Barnum and Bailey a little bit. They get their start in 1881, and so the era of the circus is this same bridge between the Gilded Age and progressivism. And, of course, closest to my heart, in 1891, James Naismith invents the wonderful game of basketball. The game of basketball is invented in 1891. Baseball has already been around, but in 1891, the game of basketball, as we know it today, begins with a couple of peach baskets hung on the walls of a Massachusetts school. So, anyway, what I want you to take away from this is that the Gilded Age is giving way to progressivism. And the question becomes, who can lead during this new era, and also who should lead during this era? And those are very, very loaded questions that the progressives try to answer. And in some ways, they answer them in a way that even in the modern day we see as morally righteous. And in other ways, while they're progressive in some areas, they seem very, very racist or otherwise behind the times in what they're doing. So we're going to look at that in the future as we see how, while progressivism at home gives way to imperialism abroad, and how the people can be both welcoming of certain things and totally bigoted and locked in their ways regarding others. So this was the bridge, and next week we will talk about progressivism and imperialism and start the 20th century. Thanks so much for watching.